Imagine being born into a neighborhood where your future was decided before your first birthday. Everyone already knew your family name, but nobody explained why. You thought they were being friendly, but they were actually judging your future. You had no idea your life was already following someone else's plan. Then your father said 7 words that would change everything forever. Respect keeps families alive. You didn't understand those words, yet. You believed your father repaired buildings, because that's all he ever told you. Years passed, and one ordinary afternoon changed your life forever. For the first time, they didn't just watch you, they called your name. Your heart raced, but your feet kept moving toward them. Every step felt heavier, like the entire street was holding its breath. Then the heavy wooden door slowly opened, and your childhood ended. Nobody welcomed you. They simply watched you think. No introductions, no speeches, just complete silence. You suddenly realized this wasn't an invitation. It was a test. You resisted the urge to speak first, and that saved you. The oldest man finally leaned forward and smiled. "Tell us about yourself." The real test had finally begun. You spoke honestly, because pretending would have been obvious. Nobody interrupted, and somehow that made you even more nervous. Then the oldest man asked a question nobody expected. "Who deserves respect first, you or your family?" You almost answered immediately, then stopped yourself. You realized they weren't testing your answer, they were testing your patience. You answered carefully, and the entire room became completely still. Then something unexpected happened. The leader laughed quietly. Not because you were funny, because you finally understood. Respect wasn't demanded, it was quietly earned. The meeting ended, but your journey had barely begun. Outside, your father was already waiting, and somehow he already knew. He didn't ask what happened, he simply started driving. The silence inside the car somehow said everything. Finally, your father broke the silence with one simple sentence. "I'm proud you listened more than you talked." That compliment meant more than anything you'd ever won. The next morning, your real education quietly began. You weren't taught power, you were taught people. Every handshake carried a lesson no classroom could ever teach. Nobody feared your father, yet everyone respected him. That's when you realized, respect looks surprisingly ordinary. Days turned into weeks, and every morning became another lesson. You stopped memorizing names and started remembering stories. Every conversation quietly connected another piece of the neighborhood. Then your father suddenly asked, "What have you noticed?" Your answer changed the way your father looked at you forever. For the first time, you weren't treated like a kid, but a future leader. But every lesson came with one silent warning. Trust takes years to build and seconds to lose. You promised yourself never to forget those words. Then came the moment that tested everything you'd learned. 2 respected neighbors stood frozen, waiting for someone to step in. Your first instinct was to choose a side, but you remembered your father's lesson. You listened first, and everything suddenly made sense. Neither man wanted to win, they both wanted to be understood. That's when you finally stepped forward. You repeated each man's concern before offering any solution. Their faces changed because someone finally understood both sides. You weren't solving problems, you were rebuilding trust. The crowd quietly smiled, without anyone saying a single word. Across the street, your father had watched everything. That evening, your father asked only one question. "How did you know what to say?" You smiled, because the answer surprised even you. "Because I finally listened, instead of waiting to speak." Your father nodded, like he'd been waiting years to hear those words. You thought the hardest lesson was over. You were completely wrong. The following week, your father handed you a single envelope. Inside was only one address, and no explanation. No instructions. No clues. Just trust your judgment. Would you follow directions, or discover your own path? You chose the longest road, because shortcuts rarely teach anything. Every familiar face greeted you, but nobody offered directions. You realized everyone already knew where you were going. The address led somewhere surprisingly ordinary. You expected an important office. Instead, someone invited you inside for lunch. The house was small, but every detail reflected quiet pride. Nothing looked expensive, yet everything looked deeply cared for. Then she served lunch, before asking your name. Kindness came first, introductions came later. You suddenly understood this wasn't about the address at all. The old woman finally asked, "Do you know why you're really here?" You quietly answered, "To learn something important." She smiled gently, but shook her head. "No, you came here to make someone feel remembered." Those words stayed with you long after lunch ended. Outside, the neighborhood somehow looked completely different. You stopped seeing buildings and started seeing lives. Every stranger suddenly felt like part of one larger family. Now you finally understood your father's real assignment. The address wasn't the destination. People were. When you arrived home, your father was already waiting outside. He never asked where you'd been. He simply looked into your eyes and understood. Sometimes, silence carries the loudest answers. Then your father handed back the empty envelope. Inside was a single handwritten sentence. "People will remember how you made them feel." Everything suddenly connected in your mind. Every challenge had always been about compassion, and this was only the beginning of your story. Months passed, and people started noticing something different about you. Not because you spoke louder, but because you listened longer. People trusted you with problems they never shared before. You never rushed their stories, and they noticed. Respect quietly followed you wherever you went. Then one morning, your father gave you a seat at the table. Nobody announced your arrival. They simply made room. You realized respect is never announced. It's quietly accepted. The conversation wasn't about business. It was about families. Every decision began with one question. Who does this help? Then your father looked directly at you. Everyone else became silent. What would you do? Your father calmly asked. You didn't answer immediately, and nobody rushed you. You remembered every lesson before speaking. I'd ask who needs us most before deciding anything. The room became completely silent. Then every elder slowly smiled. Your father never praised you because he didn't need to. One quiet nod meant more than 1,000 speeches. After the meeting, one elder quietly stopped you. He handed you an old photograph without saying a word. The photograph showed your father, decades before you were born. He had once walked the exact same path. Nothing had been an accident. Every lesson was intentional. You weren't building a reputation, you were continuing a thing. And now, someone would someday learn from you. Years later, your name became known for one simple reason. People always felt calmer after talking with you. You had learned the rare skill, making people feel understood. The greatest leaders rarely stand above people. They stand beside them. That was the lesson your father wanted you to discover. Then one afternoon, a nervous teenager knocked on your door. You recognized yourself from years ago. He asked, "Can you teach me?" You smiled because the answer was already waiting. You handed him the same envelope and a new beginning. You gave him only one instruction. Don't open it yet. First, spend 1 week helping people you don't know. Listen twice as much as you speak. Then, come back and open the envelope. The teenager smiled and quietly walked away. Your father quietly joined you on the porch. He smiled because the circle was complete. Some lessons survive because people choose to live. The envelope was never the lesson. People always were. Imagine if every conversation started with understanding first. Now ask yourself, what kind of legacy are you creating today? Would people remember your success or your kindness? Because in the end, kindness always outlives power. And every great story begins with one small choice. So, what will your first choice be?